November 20th, 1943, 08:54 hours, Betio Island, Tarawa Atoll, Gilbert Islands. Major Henry Pearson, Jim Crow, 41 years old from Paris, Kentucky, stood in the bow of his Higgins boat as it approached the coral reef surrounding Betio Island. Behind him, 12 Marines from the 2nd Battalion, 8th Marine Regiment clutched their rifles and scanned the shoreline 500 yards ahead. The island appeared deceptively quiet, its palm trees swaying in the tropical breeze, its coral sand beaches gleaming white in the morning sun. But Crow, a veteran of World War I who had enlisted in the Marines at age 16 by lying about his age, understood what that silence meant. The Japanese were waiting for the Americans to reach the reef, waiting for the tide to drop, waiting to turn Betio's lagoon into a killing field. 3 feet. That was the difference between life and death this morning. 3 feet of water that intelligence had promised would be there, covering the coral reef, allowing the Higgins boats to cross and deliver Marines directly to the beach. 3 feet that weren't there. As Crow's boat ground to a halt on the coral reef, 500 yards from shore, he looked back at the dozens of landing craft behind him, all stopping at the same invisible barrier. Then he looked toward the beach and saw the first muzzle flashes from Japanese machine gun positions. "Everybody out," Crow ordered. "We walk from here." What happened over the next 76 hours would become the bloodiest battle in Marine Corps history up to that point, with casualty rates exceeding 20% of the invasion force. More than 1,000 Marines would die, and another 2,000 would be wounded, capturing an island barely 2 miles long and 800 yards wide. But the lessons learned in Betio's blood-soaked lagoon would save thousands of lives in later operations at Iwo Jima, Okinawa, and the beaches of Normandy. The Battle of Tarawa would prove that amphibious assault against a fortified position was possible, but only at a price so terrible that it would force the US military to completely reimagine how such operations were planned and executed. Tarawa Atoll lies in the Gilbert Islands, approximately 2,400 miles southwest of Hawaii and 1,600 miles northeast of the Solomon Islands. The atoll is roughly triangular, consisting of a coral reef enclosing a lagoon with several small islands along its perimeter. The largest and most strategically valuable of these islands was Betio, located at the atoll's southwestern corner. Betio measured approximately 2.5 miles long and 800 yards wide at its widest point, giving it a total area of roughly 291 acres. The island's elevation above sea level rarely exceeded 10 feet. It was covered with coconut palms, pandanus trees, and dense tropical vegetation. Before the war, it had been home to a small native population and a British colonial administrative post. In September 1942, Japanese forces occupied Tarawa as part of their defensive perimeter across the Central Pacific. Rear Admiral K.G. Shibasaki, commanding the Japanese garrison, recognized Betio's strategic importance immediately. The island's location made it an ideal base for reconnaissance aircraft and a critical link in Japan's defensive chain. Perhaps more importantly, it could serve as an unsinkable aircraft carrier, threatening American supply lines to Australia and supporting operations throughout the Central Pacific. Shibasaki set about transforming Betio into one of the most heavily fortified positions in the Pacific theater. Over 14 months, Japanese engineers and Korean laborers constructed a defensive system that military historians would later study as a masterpiece of fortification design. The construction effort was staggering in scale and sophistication. The Japanese built more than 500 pillboxes, bunkers, and fortified positions across the island. These structures were not simple sandbag emplacements, but sophisticated concrete and steel bunkers reinforced with coconut logs, coral sand, and armor plating salvaged from ships. Some bunkers featured walls 5 feet thick, capable of withstanding direct hits from naval gunfire and bombs. The larger command bunkers had walls 8 feet thick and roofs constructed from steel beams covered with layers of sand and coral. The defensive system was designed with interlocking fields of fire, ensuring that every approach to the beach was covered by multiple machine gun positions. Japanese engineers positioned 8-inch coastal defense guns captured during the fall of Singapore to defend against naval attack. These Vickers guns, British-made and capable of firing 250-pound shells, were mounted in heavily reinforced bunkers that could survive all but the luckiest direct hits. Medium artillery, including 4 140mm guns and several 75mm mountain guns, provided additional firepower. These weapons were positioned to cover the beaches and lagoon, with carefully prepared firing data for every possible landing zone. Light artillery, mortars, and numerous machine gun positions completed the defensive array. Perhaps most importantly, Shibasaki understood that the coral reef surrounding Betio was his best defense. The reef extended anywhere from 500 to 1,200 yards from the beach, depending on location. At high tide, there would be sufficient water depth for landing craft to cross the reef. At low tide, the reef would be exposed or covered by only a few inches of water, forcing attacking forces to wade through chest-deep water while under fire. Shibasaki boasted that Betio could not be taken by assault, with less than 1 million men fighting for 100 days. His confidence was not mere bravado. He commanded approximately 4,500 troops, including 2,600 elite Special Naval Landing Force troops, Japan's equivalent of Marines, and nearly 2,000 Korean laborers who had been trained and armed as infantry. His men were well supplied, well trained, and prepared to fight to the death. The American decision to assault Tarawa came from the highest levels of Pacific Command. Admiral Chester Nimitz, Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet, needed to advance across the Central Pacific toward the Philippines and ultimately Japan. The Gilbert Islands, including Tarawa, represented the first stepping stone in this island-hopping campaign. Major General Julian Smith, 56 years old, from Elkton, Maryland, commanded the 2nd Marine Division, which would conduct the assault. Smith was a veteran officer who had enlisted in the Marines in 1909 and earned his commission in 1911. He had served in France during World War I and had spent the interwar years studying amphibious warfare, understanding that future conflicts would require the ability to seize defended beaches from the sea. Smith and his staff spent weeks planning the Tarawa operation, designated Operation Galvanic. They studied aerial reconnaissance photographs, examined pre-war charts of the atoll, and consulted with former British colonial officials who had lived on Tarawa. They identified 3 potential landing beaches on Betio's northern shore, designated Red Beach 1, Red Beach 2, and Red Beach 3. The plan called for 3 battalion landing teams to assault simultaneously across these beaches at high tide on the morning of November 20th. High tide would provide sufficient water depth over the coral reef for the Higgins boats, flat-bottomed landing craft designed to run up on beaches and discharge troops through their bow ramps to reach the shore directly. The critical question was the tide. The Marines needed at least 3 feet of water over the reef for the Higgins boats to clear it. Aerial reconnaissance and pre-war charts suggested that high tide on November 20th would provide approximately 5 feet of water over the reef. However, some British colonial officials who had lived on Tarawa warned that the atoll experienced unusual tide patterns, particularly in November, where neap tides, exceptionally low tides caused by the moon's position, could reduce water levels unpredictably. Major Frank Holland, a New Zealand officer who had been a trader in the Gilbert Islands before the war, specifically warned American planners that nape tides in November could leave the reef exposed or barely covered, regardless of the predicted tide schedule. His warnings were noted but not fully integrated into the operational plan. The Marines did have a backup, 125 LVT-1 and LVT-2 amphibious tractors, known as Amtraks. These tracked vehicles could cross the reef regardless of tide conditions, carrying approximately 20 troops each. However, there were only enough Amtraks for the first 3 assault waves. Subsequent waves would have to use conventional Higgins boats, which required sufficient water depth to clear the reef. The operational plan accepted this risk, assuming that once the first waves had secured the beaches, subsequent waves could land with less opposition, even if forced to wade from the reef. This assumption would prove tragically optimistic. On November 19, 1943, the invasion fleet arrived off Tarawa. The armada included 17 aircraft carriers, 12 battleships, 8 heavy cruisers, 4 light cruisers, 66 destroyers, and 36 transport ships. More than 35,000 troops would participate in operations across the Gilbert Islands, with approximately 18,000 Marines designated for the Tarawa assault specifically. The pre-assault bombardment began before dawn on November 20th. The battleships USS Maryland, USS Colorado, and USS Tennessee opened fire at 06:05 hours, their 14-inch and 16-inch guns hurling massive shells toward Betio's fortifications. The heavy cruisers USS Portland and USS Indianapolis added their 8-inch guns to the barrage. Destroyers moved closer to shore, firing their 5-inch guns at specific targets. For more than 2 hours, the bombardment continued. American commanders watched through binoculars as shells exploded across the tiny island, sending up massive columns of smoke and debris. Coconut trees were shredded, buildings collapsed, fires broke out across the island. The noise was deafening, a continuous roar of naval gunfire punctuated by the crump of exploding shells. At 0800 hours, carrier-based aircraft joined the assault. Dive bombers and torpedo bombers attacked Japanese positions, dropping bombs and strafing with machine guns. The island disappeared beneath smoke and dust. To observers on the transports, it appeared impossible that anything could survive such a bombardment. Rear Admiral Harry Hill, commanding the Naval Task Force, watched the bombardment with satisfaction. He reported to his superiors that the preliminary bombardment had been very successful and that defenses appeared neutralized. This assessment would prove tragically wrong. What Hill and other observers could not see was that the Japanese had constructed their fortifications specifically to survive such bombardments. The thick concrete and steel bunkers absorbed or deflected hits that would have destroyed typical field fortifications. Many Japanese positions were so deeply buried or so heavily reinforced that naval gunfire simply could not destroy them. The 2-hour bombardment, while impressive in sound and fury, had actually destroyed relatively few of the island's 500-plus fortified positions. At 0824 hours, the first wave of Marines boarded their Amtraks. The tracked amphibious vehicles, fully loaded with troops, ammunition, and equipment, began circling in formation approximately 4,000 yards from the beach, waiting for the signal to attack. Among these first-wave troops was Lieutenant William Dean Hawkins, 29 years old, from El Paso, Texas. Hawkins commanded a scout sniper platoon whose mission was to land first and eliminate specific Japanese strongpoints that threatened the main landing beaches. Hawkins was a Marine's Marine, aggressive, fearless, and tactically brilliant. His men worshipped him, and his superiors recognized him as one of the finest combat leaders in the division. Also in the first wave was Colonel David Monroe Shoup, 39 years old, from Battleground, Indiana. Shoup commanded Combat Team 2, the central assault force that would land on Red Beach 2. A 1926 graduate of DePaul University who had received his commission through ROTC, Shoup had spent 17 years in the Marines, much of it studying and teaching amphibious warfare. He understood the theory perfectly. He was about to experience the brutal reality. At 0854 hours, the first wave crossed the line of departure and headed toward Betio. The Amtraks moved at approximately 4 knots, their tracks churning through the lagoon's waters. Inside each vehicle, 20 Marines crouched below the armored sides, weapons ready, faces tense beneath their helmets. As the Amtraks approached the reef, Japanese defensive fire began. Machine guns opened up from concealed positions. Artillery shells exploded in the lagoon, sending up waterspouts. The 8-inch coastal defense guns fired at the landing craft, their shells creating massive explosions that could destroy an Amtrak with a direct hit. The Amtraks crossed the reef without difficulty, their tracks providing propulsion in shallow water where boats would have grounded. But the volume of fire increased dramatically as they approached the beaches. Japanese gunners, who had survived the bombardment by sheltering deep in their bunkers, emerged and manned their weapons. Every Amtrak that reached the beach was greeted with a storm of machine gun and rifle fire. At 9:10 hours, the first Amtraks reached Red Beach, one on Betio's northwestern corner. Marines poured out of the vehicles and immediately came under intense fire. Some fell before they reached cover. Others made it to the beach and took shelter behind a coconut log seawall that the Japanese had constructed as a barrier against landing craft. The seawall, ironically, became the Marines' only protection. Built from coconut logs and coral rock, it stood approximately 4 feet high and ran parallel to the beach. Marines huddled behind it, trying to find firing positions to return fire against the Japanese bunkers that dominated every approach inland. Lieutenant Hawkins and his scout sniper platoon landed at 9:12 hours. Hawkins immediately identified a concrete bunker on a pier extending into the lagoon that was enfilading the landing beaches with machine gun fire. Without hesitation, Hawkins led a small team along the pier toward the bunker, advancing under fire. Using grenades and flamethrowers, they destroyed the bunker and killed its occupants. Then Hawkins moved to the next strong point, and the next, methodically eliminating Japanese positions that threatened the landing beaches. On Red Beach 2, the central landing zone, the situation was similar. Marines reached the beach and found themselves pinned down behind the seawall by devastating fire from bunkers and pillboxes that the bombardment had failed to destroy. Colonel Shoup's Amtrak was hit by artillery fire 50 yards from the beach. The vehicle's transmission was damaged, and it began taking on water. Shoup and his command group abandoned the crippled vehicle and waded through chest-deep water to the beach under constant fire. Shoup established his command post in a Japanese bunker that had been captured by the first wave. From this position, barely 20 yards inland from the beach, he attempted to coordinate the assault, but communication was nearly impossible. Radios had been soaked during the landing and many were not working. Messages had to be carried by runners who had to expose themselves to murderous fire to move even a few yards. At 1000 hours, the second wave began its approach to the beaches. These Marines were in Higgins boats, not Amtraks. As they approached the reef, they discovered what Major Holland had warned about. The tide was wrong. Instead of 5 feet of water over the reef, there were barely 3 inches. The Higgins boats ground to a halt on the coral, 500 to 700 yards from the beach. The coxswains dropped their bow ramps. Marines looked out at the expansive lagoon between themselves and the beach, realized what was required, and began climbing out into the water. Private First Class Robert Mulbach, 19 years old, from Warsaw, Wisconsin, stood at the bow ramp of his Higgins boat and stared at the water between himself and the beach. He could see Marines from earlier waves already ashore, pinned down behind the seawall. He could see the flashes from Japanese guns firing from bunkers that appeared untouched by the bombardment. And he could see the splashes in the water where machine gun bullets were hitting, marching toward his boat. "Move! Move! Move!" his sergeant shouted. Mulbach jumped into the water. It came up to his chest. His 70-pound pack immediately soaked through, adding weight that threatened to drag him under. He held his M1 rifle above his head and began wading toward shore. The 500 yards to the beach should have taken perhaps 5 minutes at a normal walking pace. In chest-deep water, wearing full combat equipment, under enemy fire, it took most Marines 30 to 45 minutes. Many never made it. The Japanese defenders had prepared for exactly this scenario. Machine gun positions were pre-registered on the approaches from the reef. Mortar crews had calculated firing data for every possible landing route. As Marines waded through the lagoon, they were exposed to flanking fire from multiple directions with no cover whatsoever. Men began falling. Some were hit by machine gun fire and simply disappeared beneath the water. Others were wounded and struggled to stay afloat, their equipment dragging them down. Still others made it partway to shore before being hit, collapsing into water that was now being churned by bullets and stained red with blood. Those who reached the beach found limited shelter. The seawall provided protection from direct fire, but Japanese mortars could still hit positions behind it, and there was no room. The narrow beach was already crowded with Marines from the first waves. Casualties were mounting, but there was nowhere to put the wounded. Medical corpsmen worked frantically to treat injuries, but many men bled out while waiting for attention. Major Crow, who had led his men across the reef in the first wave, moved along the beach attempting to organize the assault inland. Every attempt to advance beyond the seawall met with devastating fire from Japanese positions that appeared invulnerable to American weapons. The heavy machine guns were firing from bunkers with firing ports barely 2 feet wide. Hand grenades thrown at these positions simply bounced off the concrete. Small arms fire was ineffective against the thick walls. The Marines needed armor support, but the medium tanks that were supposed to land with the assault waves were still offshore. Of the 14 Sherman tanks allocated to the first day's operations, only 2 reached the beach in the morning. The others were delayed by the reef, by Japanese fire, by mechanical problems, or were destroyed before reaching shore. At 10:30 hours, Colonel Shoup radioed to Major General Julian Smith aboard the command ship USS Maryland. "Issue in doubt." 3 words that conveyed the desperate situation. The landing was not proceeding according to plan. Marines were dying by the dozen, pinned down on a narrow beach with Japanese positions largely intact and functioning. Smith faced a terrible decision. He could commit his reserve forces, sending more Marines into what appeared to be a slaughter, or he could halt the assault, regroup, and attempt the landing again under better conditions. The second option would mean abandoning the Marines already ashore, leaving them to be destroyed by the Japanese garrison. There was no real choice. At 1100 hours, Smith ordered the reserve battalion to land. The 1st Battalion, 8th Marines, commanded by Major Lawrence Hayes Jr., began loading into Higgins boats. They would face the same wave that had cost so many casualties in earlier waves. On Red Beach 3, the eastern landing zone, the situation was slightly better. This beach was partially sheltered by the long pier that extended into the lagoon. Some of the Higgins boats had been able to nose up to the pier and discharge their troops onto the structure itself, allowing Marines to advance along the pier toward the beach rather than wading through the lagoon. But the pier was under constant fire. Japanese positions on the beach and inland could rake its length with machine guns. Lieutenant Hawkins, having already destroyed several enemy positions, continued working his way along the beach, identifying threats and leading assaults against bunkers and pillboxes. His tactical judgment was impeccable, his courage absolute. His men followed him because they trusted him completely. By noon, approximately 5,000 Marines had landed on Betio. Of these, roughly 1,500 were casualties, killed or wounded. The beachhead was barely 100 yards deep at its furthest inland penetration. The Marines held a thin strip of beach and nothing more. Japanese counterattacks, while not yet materialized, were expected at any moment. The division commander, Major General Julian Smith, watched the battle from his command ship and wrestled with the question of whether to continue or abort. Reports from shore were fragmentary and often contradictory. Communications were extremely difficult. Radio equipment continued to malfunction due to saltwater damage. Runners were being killed trying to deliver messages across open ground. What Smith could see clearly was the catastrophic toll being taken on his Marines in the lagoon. Every boat that grounded on the reef disgorged men who had to wade hundreds of yards under fire. The casualty rate among these later waves exceeded 50%. Men were dying before they reached the fight. At 1300 hours, Colonel Shoup sent another message. Casualties heavy. Enemy fire effective. Situation: we are winning. The last 3 words were crucial. Despite the horrific losses, despite being pinned down on a narrow beach, Shoup believed the Marines were gaining the upper hand. The assessment was as much determination as tactical analysis. Lieutenant Colonel Herbert Amy, commanding the 2nd Battalion, 2nd Marines, landed at 1330 hours with his battalion headquarters. Amy was a 35-year-old career officer from California. His battalion was supposed to be the reserve force, committed only after the initial objectives had been secured. Instead, they were being fed into a desperate fight for survival. Amy's Higgins boat grounded on the reef. He and his staff climbed out and began wading toward Red Beach 2. They had made it perhaps 200 yards when Japanese machine gun fire found them. Amy was hit multiple times and killed instantly. His executive officer took command and continued toward shore. Of the 12 officers in the battalion headquarters group, 9 would be casualties before the day ended. The afternoon brought no respite. The Marines continued trying to push inland from the beaches, attacking Japanese strongpoints one at a time. The bunkers and pillboxes were so well constructed that conventional weapons were largely useless against them. Marines learned to attack each position methodically, use grenades to suppress the firing ports, get a flamethrower team close enough to shoot burning fuel through the ports, then assault with explosives to destroy the structure. This technique worked, but it was time-consuming and costly. Each bunker might take 30 minutes to an hour to reduce, during which the assault team was exposed to fire from other positions. And there were hundreds of bunkers across the island. By 1600 hours, the Marines had managed to establish a tenuous foothold on Betio. The beachhead was approximately 500 yards wide and 150 yards deep at its furthest penetration. 3 battalion command posts were functioning, though barely. Colonel Shoup's position behind the seawall on Red Beach, too, had become the de facto headquarters for the entire operation. Medical personnel were overwhelmed. Wounded Marines lay in rows on the beach, waiting for evacuation, but getting wounded men off the island was nearly as difficult as getting reinforcements on. Boats trying to evacuate casualties had to survive the same gauntlet of fire that had decimated the landing waves. As sunset approached, the Marines prepared for what they expected would be a massive Japanese counterattack. Standard Japanese doctrine called for nighttime banzai charges, massed infantry assaults designed to overrun defensive positions through sheer numbers and aggression. The Marines had too few men, too little ammunition, and too narrow a perimeter to withstand such an attack if it came in force. Colonel Shoup established a defensive line as far inland as possible. Machine guns were positioned with interlocking fields of fire. Artillery forward observers called in coordinates for defensive fires. Every Marine who could hold a rifle was placed on the line. The wounded who could still fight were given positions. There would be no reserve. Everything was committed. But the expected counterattack never came. The Japanese commander, Rear Admiral Shibasaki, had been killed during the pre-assault bombardment when a shell scored a direct hit on his command bunker. Without central direction, Japanese forces defended their positions tenaciously but did not coordinate a unified counterattack. This failure to exploit the Marines' vulnerability during the first night would prove decisive. The night of November 20th to 21st was one of terror and confusion. Japanese infiltrators probed the Marine lines, attempting to locate weak points. Small firefights erupted along the perimeter. Flares lit up the darkness at irregular intervals, casting grotesque shadows. Marines stared into the blackness beyond their positions, trying to distinguish real threats from shadows and imagination. But the night passed without the feared banzai charge. When dawn broke on November 21st, the Marines still held their beachhead. They had survived the first day. The second day began with a continuation of the brutal yard-by-yard advance. The Marines now understood what they faced. They had learned the hard way how to assault Japanese fortifications. They had paid a terrible price for that knowledge, but now they could begin applying it systematically. Major Crow led attacks on several key bunkers that had dominated approaches on Red Beach 1. His method was methodical. Reconnaissance to identify all firing ports and support positions, then simultaneous attacks from multiple directions using flamethrowers, explosives, and covering fire. Each bunker captured opened up new avenues of advance and reduced Japanese fire on the beaches. Lieutenant Hawkins continued his one-man war against Japanese strongpoints. On the morning of November 21st, he led his scout sniper platoon against a series of bunkers near the airfield that dominated the interior of the island. He personally destroyed 5 positions, exposing himself to enemy fire repeatedly. Around midday, while assaulting another bunker, Hawkins was hit by Japanese fire. He was evacuated to the beach but died of his wounds that evening. He would be posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor, the first of several awarded for actions on Tarawa. By noon on November 21st, the Marines had expanded their beachhead significantly. They now controlled approximately half the island, including the eastern end where the Japanese airfield was located. But the western half remained firmly in Japanese hands, and the defenders showed no signs of surrendering. Colonel Shoup, who had been wounded on the first day but refused evacuation, continued commanding from his bunker command post. His leadership was inspirational. Despite his wounds, despite the chaos, despite the mounting casualties, Shoup remained calm, focused, and determined. His radio messages to division headquarters were models of professional reporting, clear assessments of the situation, specific requests for support, and confidence that the Marines would prevail. The Sherman tanks that had finally reached the beach on the morning of the 21st proved invaluable in reducing Japanese positions. The tanks' 75mm guns could destroy bunkers that had resisted all other weapons. But the tanks were vulnerable to Japanese close assault teams armed with magnetic mines and satchel charges. Tank infantry cooperation became essential, with Marine infantry protecting the tanks from close attack, while the tanks provided fire support for infantry assaults. By the end of the second day, November 21st, the Marines had suffered approximately 325 additional casualties, but had made significant progress. The beachhead was secure. The airfield was in American hands. Japanese resistance was being compressed into the western third of the island. The battle was far from over, but the outcome was no longer in doubt. The third day, November 22nd, saw continued attacks against remaining Japanese positions. The fighting was still brutal, still costly, but now more organized and systematic. The Marines had learned to work together, infantry, armor, engineers, and artillery, to methodically destroy each strong point. Major Crow led one of the final assaults against Japanese positions on the western end of the island. His battalion had been reduced from 800 men to fewer than 400, but they continued attacking with the same determination they had shown on the first day. Crow himself was everywhere, encouraging his men, directing attacks, exposing himself to enemy fire without apparent concern for his own safety. By the afternoon of November 22nd, organized Japanese resistance had largely ceased. Small groups continued fighting from individual bunkers, but the coordinated defense had collapsed. The Marines began the grim work of clearing the remaining positions, searching bunkers for holdouts, and recovering the bodies of both American and Japanese dead. On November 23rd, the fourth day, the island was declared secure. The Battle of Tarawa was over. The casualty figures were staggering and would shock the American public when they were released. Of approximately 18,000 Marines who participated in operations across Tarawa Atoll, those who landed on Betio suffered the overwhelming majority of casualties. The 2nd Marine Division reported 1,009 Marines killed and 2,101 wounded on Betio. The casualty rate among the assault battalions exceeded 20% overall, but for the units that landed in the first 2 days, the rate was much higher. Some rifle companies that landed with 200 men reported 50% casualties by the end of the first day. The Japanese garrison was virtually annihilated. Of approximately 4,500 Japanese and Korean troops on the island, only 17 Japanese and 129 Koreans were captured alive. The rest died fighting from their positions or committed suicide rather than surrender. American burial parties would spend weeks recovering and burying Japanese dead from the bunkers and fortifications across the island. The Marines also lost significant equipment. Approximately 90 Amtraks were destroyed or damaged beyond repair. 3 Sherman tanks were knocked out. Hundreds of weapons, tons of ammunition, and vast quantities of supplies were lost in the lagoon or destroyed during the fighting. The Navy suffered casualties as well. The escort carrier USS Liscombe was torpedoed and sunk by a Japanese submarine on November 24th while supporting operations in the Gilbert Islands. The carrier exploded and sank in 23 minutes, killing 644 of its 916 crew members, including Rear Admiral Henry Mullinex. For the Marines who survived Betio, the memory of the battle would never fade. The wade through the lagoon under fire became emblematic of their experience. The sight of the beach covered with bodies, the smell of death in the tropical heat, the sound of wounded men calling for corpsmen, the absolute terror of attacking concrete bunkers that seemed impervious to any weapon. These memories would haunt survivors for the rest of their lives. War correspondent Robert Sherrod, who had landed with the Marines and spent 3 days on Betio documenting the battle, wrote a dispatch that shocked readers back home. "I have seen Marines in the lagoon, shot dead while they tried to wade 700 yards from the reef to the beach. I have seen them pile up on the beach where they fell, victim after victim, while I counted them. The first night ashore I slept, but I did not really sleep, for I heard the mortars thumping and the machine guns crackling and the rifle shots snapping, and I kept wondering when one of those bullets or shells would find me." Sherrod's account, published in Time magazine and later in his book, Tarawa, The Story of a Battle, brought the reality of the battle to the American public. Previous coverage of Pacific battles had emphasized American victories and Japanese defeats, often minimizing American casualties. Sherrod's honest reporting of Tarawa's costs created controversy. Some military officials felt he had been too graphic, too critical of the operations planning. But Sherrod had simply told the truth. Photographs from Tarawa, particularly those showing Marine bodies in the lagoon and on the beach, were initially censored by military authorities who feared their impact on public morale. President Franklin Roosevelt personally intervened to allow their publication, arguing that the American people needed to understand the true costs of the war. When the photographs appeared in Life magazine in December 1943, they shocked the nation. The public response was complex. Many Americans were horrified by the casualties and questioned whether capturing such a small island was worth so many lives. Congressional representatives called for investigations. Military planners faced tough questions about why the casualties had been so high. But within the military, particularly among those responsible for planning future operations, Tarawa was studied intensively as a learning opportunity. What had gone wrong? What had worked? How could future operations avoid similar casualties? The tide issue was obvious in hindsight. The Marines had assaulted at any AP tide based on calculations that proved incorrect. The lack of sufficient Amtraks to carry all waves across the reef, regardless of tide, had forced thousands of Marines to wade hundreds of yards under fire. Future operations would ensure sufficient Amtraks or similar vehicles were available for all assault waves. The naval bombardment had been inadequate. 2 hours of shelling had not destroyed the Japanese fortifications. Future operations would feature longer, more intensive bombardments. At Kwajalein 2 months later, the pre-assault bombardment lasted 4 days. At Iwo Jima, it would last 3 days with more tonnage of shells than had been fired at Tarawa in the entire 3-day battle. The need for close air support was clear. Carrier aircraft had provided support at Tarawa, but coordination between air and ground forces had been poor. Future operations would feature dedicated close air support aircraft working directly with forward air controllers on the ground. Underwater demolition teams would be essential. At Tarawa, there had been no systematic effort to clear obstacles or identify reef conditions before the assault. Future operations would employ specialized Navy teams to scout beaches, clear obstacles, and provide accurate information about conditions. Tank infantry cooperation needed improvement. The tanks that reached Betio had been invaluable in reducing Japanese bunkers, but coordination with infantry had been improvised under fire. Future operations would train tank infantry teams extensively before combat. Medical evacuation needed better planning. The difficulty of evacuating wounded from Betio had cost lives. Future operations would pre-position hospital ships and plan dedicated evacuation routes. Perhaps most importantly, Tarawa demonstrated that heavily fortified positions could be taken by amphibious assault, but only with proper planning, adequate resources, and the willingness to accept significant casualties. The operation validated the concept of amphibious warfare while highlighting the need for better execution. Major General Julian Smith, commanding the 2nd Marine Division, wrote in his after-action report, "In the final analysis, the capture of Betio was made possible only by the individual courage, resourcefulness, and determination of the Marines themselves. The lessons learned at Tarawa were purchased in blood, but they will save lives in future operations." Smith's assessment was accurate. The lessons from Tarawa directly influenced planning for subsequent operations throughout the Pacific and in the European theater. At Kwajalein in January 1944, 2 months after Tarawa, the Marines implemented the lessons learned. The pre-assault bombardment lasted 4 days instead of 2 hours. Underwater demolition teams scouted the beaches and cleared obstacles. Sufficient Amtraks were provided for all assault waves. The result was a dramatic reduction in casualties. The Kwajalein garrison, larger than Betio's, was defeated with American casualties of 372 killed, compared to Tarawa's 1,009. At Saipan in June 1944, the Marines again applied Tarawa's lessons. The assault featured extensive naval bombardment, thorough reconnaissance, and improved amphibious vehicles. While casualties were still significant due to Saipan's size and the strength of its garrison, the assault phase proceeded much more smoothly than at Tarawa. At Iwo Jima in February 1945, perhaps the bloodiest battle in Marine Corps history, the planning bore Tarawa's fingerprints. The 3-day bombardment, the employment of underwater demolition teams, the use of improved Amtraks and armored amphibians, the integration of close air support, all reflected lessons learned 15 months earlier on Betio. Even the Normandy landings on June 6, 1944, benefited from Tarawa's lessons. Allied planners studied the battle intensively. They ensured that specialized armor would land with the first waves, the British funnies, and American duplex drive tanks. They planned for naval bombardment that would continue during the landing rather than stopping before troops went ashore. They developed specialized landing craft for tanks and artillery. While the European theater presented different challenges than the Pacific, the fundamental lessons about amphibious assault against fortified positions came partly from Tarawa. Colonel David Shoup, who had commanded on Red Beach 2 during those desperate first days, recovered from his wounds and continued serving. He received the Medal of Honor for his leadership during the battle, the citation noting his brilliant leadership, daring tactics, and selfless devotion to duty during the assault. Shoup would eventually rise to Commandant of the Marine Corps, serving from 1960 to 1963. Throughout his career, he emphasized the importance of the lessons learned at Tarawa. Major Jim Crow, whose men had been among the first to wade across the reef, survived the battle and continued fighting throughout the Pacific campaign. He commanded a battalion at Saipan and Okinawa, earning the Navy Cross and multiple Silver Stars for his continued bravery under fire. Crow retired as a colonel and spent his later years speaking to Marine units about the importance of leadership and the lessons of Tarawa. Lieutenant William Hawkins, who had destroyed numerous Japanese positions during the first 2 days of the battle, was posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor. His citation read in part, "First Lieutenant Hawkins, consistently disregarding his own personal safety, repeatedly led his men in furious assault against pillboxes and installations fortified with machine guns and rifles, clearing the way for the advance of the landing force." The field on Betio, where he died, was named Hawkins Field in his honor. War correspondent Robert Sherrod continued covering Marine operations throughout the Pacific. His book, Tarawa, The Story of a Battle, became required reading for military officers studying amphibious warfare. Sherrod's honest reporting helped the American public understand the true costs of the Pacific campaign and the courage of the Marines fighting it. Tarawa Atoll today is part of the Republic of Kiribati, an independent nation in the Central Pacific. Betio Island has grown into a town of approximately 15,000 people, the second largest population center in Kiribati. Modern buildings have replaced most of the wartime structures, but reminders of the battle remain. Several of the massive Japanese bunkers still stand, their concrete walls testament to the engineering skill of their builders. The walls bear scars from the battle, shell impacts, bullet holes, blast damage. Some bunkers have been incorporated into modern structures. Others stand alone as informal monuments to the battle. The guns that defended Betio remain as well. Several of the 8-inch coastal defense guns still point toward the lagoon from their fortified positions. The steel has rusted in the tropical climate, but the weapons remain largely intact, silent witnesses to the battle. The airfield that the Marines fought so hard to capture still operates as Bonriki International Airport, the main airport for Tarawa. Commercial flights land on the same runway that Marine Corps aircraft began using within days of the battle's conclusion. In the lagoon, remnants of the battle lie beneath the water. Amtraks that were disabled during the assault rest on the coral reef. Shell casings, equipment, and debris from 1943 can still be found by divers exploring the area. The Kiribati government has declared the lagoon a protected historical site. On Betio itself, several memorials honor those who fought and died there. A memorial near Red Beach lists the names of Marines killed during the battle. A separate memorial honors the Japanese and Korean dead. These monuments, erected decades after the battle by veterans organizations and the governments of the United States, Japan, and Kiribati, represent reconciliation between former enemies. The American Battle Monuments Commission maintains a memorial at the National Memorial Cemetery of the Pacific in Honolulu, where many of the Tarawa dead are buried or commemorated. The memorial includes a relief map showing Betio Island and the landing beaches, along with bronze plaques listing the names of those who died. Japanese visitors occasionally come to Betio to pay respects at the Japanese memorial. The bunker that served as Rear Admiral Shibasaki's command post, where he died during the pre-assault bombardment, has been preserved as an unofficial memorial. Japanese tourists leave flowers and incense, honoring the garrison that fought to the death defending the island. The battle's legacy extends far beyond physical monuments. In military academies and staff colleges around the world, Tarawa is studied as a case study in amphibious warfare. The planning failures, the tactical innovations, the courage under fire, and the lessons learned all provide material for analysis and discussion. The United States Marine Corps considers Tarawa a defining moment in its history. The battle demonstrated that the Corps could execute the mission it had been training for, amphibious assault against a heavily defended shore. The casualties were terrible, but the Marines had prevailed through courage, determination, and tactical adaptation. Every Marine who graduates from basic training learns about Tarawa as part of their education in Corps history. The Tide issue remains a cautionary tale about the importance of accurate intelligence and contingency planning. Military planners use Tarawa as an example of what happens when operations proceed, despite warnings from experts who have local knowledge. Major Frank Holland's warnings about neap tides had been noted but not adequately integrated into the operational plan. The cost of this oversight was measured in hundreds of lives. The naval bombardment question sparked debates that continue today. Had the bombardment been adequate? Should it have lasted longer? Were the right targets selected? These questions have no simple answers. The Japanese fortifications at Betio were extraordinarily well built and properly defended. It's unclear whether even a longer bombardment would have destroyed enough positions to significantly reduce Marine casualties during the assault. What is clear is that Tarawa forced the U.S. military to completely rethink how amphibious assaults should be conducted. The improvements implemented after Tarawa, longer bombardments, better reconnaissance, improved amphibious vehicles, underwater demolition teams, enhanced close air support, better medical evacuation, saved thousands of lives in subsequent operations. The strategic value of capturing Tarawa has been debated by historians. The island provided an airfield from which American aircraft could support operations in the Marshall Islands. It demonstrated American ability to penetrate Japan's defensive perimeter. It forced the Japanese to spread their limited resources across a wider area. But some historians argue that Tarawa could have been bypassed, isolated, and left to wither while American forces advanced elsewhere. Admiral Chester Nimitz defended the operation, arguing that the lessons learned at Tarawa were invaluable and that avoiding the battle would have simply meant paying the same price somewhere else. Tarawa was the first Central Pacific island to be taken by the United States, Nimitz wrote in his memoirs. It had to be taken to learn how. Terrible as the losses were, they would have been far greater had we not learned. The human cost of those lessons remains sobering. More than 1,000 Marines died capturing an island 2 miles long. Their average age was 19. Many had enlisted shortly after Pearl Harbor and had been in the Marines for less than 2 years. They had trained for months, sailed halfway around the world, and died wading through chest-deep water toward a beach held by a determined enemy. The families of those who died at Tarawa received telegrams informing them of their loss. Parents who had seen their sons off to war with pride and worry received official notification that those sons would not be coming home. Wives and girlfriends who had written letters and waited for responses learned that there would be no more letters. Children who barely remembered their fathers grew up with only photographs and stories. The Marines who survived carried physical and psychological scars for the rest of their lives. Many suffered from what would later be recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder, though in 1943 it was simply called combat fatigue or battle exhaustion. They had nightmares about wading through the lagoon, about the sound of bullets hitting water around them, about friends dying beside them. Some could never speak about what they had experienced. Others spoke about it constantly, as if talking about it might somehow make sense of it. Veterans of Tarawa formed associations and held reunions, gathering annually to remember the battle and their fallen comrades. These reunions provided opportunities for the veterans to connect with others who understood what they had been through, to share memories, and to honor those who had not survived. As the years passed and the veterans aged, these gatherings became increasingly poignant. Each year, fewer survivors, each year, more empty chairs. The last reunion of Tarawa veterans was held in 2018, 75 years after the battle. Only a handful of survivors attended, all in their 90s. They traveled to Hawaii for the ceremony, some in wheelchairs, all determined to honor their fallen comrades one more time. They placed wreaths at the memorial, shared stories, and promised to never forget. Within a few years, all would be gone, taking their first-hand memories of the battle with them. But the legacy of Tarawa lives on in the institutions and practices shaped by the battle. The modern United States Marine Corps, with its emphasis on amphibious operations, its specialized equipment and training, and its warrior culture, was forged in part on Betio's beaches. The Navy's amphibious warfare community, the underwater demolition teams that evolved into the Navy SEALs, the close air support doctrine used by all U.S. military services, all trace their development to lessons learned at Tarawa. Military historians continue to study the battle, writing books and articles that analyze what went right, what went wrong, and what it all meant. Dozens of books have been published about Tarawa, from technical military histories to personal memoirs to photographic studies. Each adds to our understanding of what happened during those 76 hours in November 1943. Documentary filmmakers have produced multiple films about the battle, using combat footage shot by Marine Corps cameramen during the assault, interviews with survivors, and modern footage of the island. These documentaries preserve the visual record of the battle and ensure that future generations can see what the Marines faced. The debate about whether Tarawa was necessary continues among historians and military analysts. Some argue that the casualties were disproportionate to the strategic value of the island. Others maintain that the lessons learned justified the cost. Both sides acknowledge that the Marines who fought there displayed extraordinary courage and that their sacrifice deserves to be remembered and honored. What cannot be debated is that Tarawa changed how amphibious warfare was conducted. Before Tarawa, amphibious assault against a heavily fortified position was theoretical, studied in military colleges but never tested in combat. After Tarawa, it was proven possible, and the methods for doing it successfully had been written in blood on Betio's beaches. The 3 feet of water that weren't there on November 20th, 1943, cost 1,000 Marines their lives. But the lessons learned from that miscalculation and from the battle that followed saved many more lives in the years that followed. Every Marine who landed at Iwo Jima, Okinawa, or any other Pacific island benefited from what was learned at Tarawa. Every soldier who landed at Normandy on D-Day benefited from those same lessons. The men who waded through Betio's lagoon under fire, who fought their way across a bullet-swept beach, who attacked concrete bunkers with rifles and grenades and flamethrowers, who held a thin defensive line through a terrifying night. Those men changed the course of the Pacific War and influenced military operations for generations to come. Their courage under fire, their refusal to quit despite impossible odds, their determination to complete the mission regardless of cost. These qualities exemplified the Marine Corps ethos that no obstacle is too great, no enemy too strong, no mission impossible. They proved that ordinary young men, properly trained and led, could accomplish extraordinary things. Major General Julian Smith, who commanded the operation and who witnessed the courage of his Marines from the command ship, wrote in his final report, "I can recall no finer example of personal courage and dedication to duty under the most desperate circumstances than that displayed by the men who attacked Betio. The operation cost us dearly, but it demonstrated beyond any doubt that the Marines can take any objective they are assigned, regardless of the difficulties involved. On Betio today, life goes on. Children play on beaches where Marines died. Families live in houses built on ground where desperate battles were fought. The island that was once synonymous with death and destruction is now a living community, looking toward the future rather than dwelling on its violent past. But the bunkers remain and the memorials stand, and occasionally visitors come to walk the beaches and try to imagine what it was like on those November days in 1943. They stand where the seawall once provided the only shelter. They look out at the lagoon and try to picture hundreds of Marines wading through water that was never supposed to be there, under fire from positions that were never supposed to survive the bombardment, advancing toward an objective that military experts said was impregnable. And they remember that 1,000 young Americans proved the experts wrong at the cost of their lives, and in doing so changed the course of history. The Battle of Tarawa stands as a testament to courage, sacrifice, and the terrible price of amphibious warfare. It reminds us that military victory often requires paying costs that seem almost unbearable. It teaches that preparation, planning, and learning from mistakes can save lives in future operations. And it honors the memory of those who did what they were asked to do, no matter the cost, no matter the odds. 76 hours, an island 2 miles long, more than 1,000 Americans and 4,500 Japanese dead. And lessons learned that would echo across the remainder of World War II and influence military operations for decades to come. That is the legacy of Tarawa, written in blood on coral sand, remembered in monuments and memorials, and honored in the history of the United States Marine Corps. The Marines who fought at Tarawa did not fight for glory or fame. They fought because their country asked them to, because their buddies beside them were depending on them, because they were Marines and Marines don't quit. Many paid with their lives, all paid with pieces of themselves they could never get back. But they accomplished the mission, proved that the impossible was possible, and ensured that their sacrifice would save the lives of those who came after them. That is why we remember Tarawa. Not because it was easy or glorious, but because it was hard and terrible and necessary. Not because everything went according to plan, but because brave men adapted when plans failed and accomplished the mission anyway. Not to celebrate war, but to honor those who fought in it and to learn from their experience so that future battles might be won with fewer casualties. The tide that wasn't there, the bunkers that wouldn't die, the reef that became a killing field, these became part of Marine Corps legend. But more importantly, they became lessons that saved lives, improved tactics, and demonstrated that human courage and determination can overcome even the most desperate circumstances. The Marines who died at Tarawa did not die in vain. They died accomplishing a mission that contributed to Allied victory in the Pacific. They died proving that amphibious assault was possible. They died teaching lessons that would save their fellow Marines in battles yet to come. Their sacrifice was real, their courage absolute, their legacy enduring. On the beaches of Betio, in the waters of Tarawa's lagoon, in the bunkers and pillboxes scattered across the island, the ghosts of November 1943 remain. They whisper to us across the decades, reminding us of the price of freedom, the cost of victory, and the courage of ordinary people asked to do extraordinary things. We remember Tarawa. We honor those who fought there. We learn from their sacrifice, and we ensure that their courage, their determination, and their willingness to pay any price to accomplish the mission remain part of the American military tradition that has defended freedom around the world for generations. That is the story of Tarawa. That is the legacy of 3 feet of water that weren't there, and of 1,000 Marines who accomplished the impossible anyway.